As beginner string players start to get acquainted with their instrument, they start to realize that drawing the bow across the string is not as simple as it seems. Most of the time, simply moving your arm will cause the bow to move diagonally or generally kind of haphazardly around the strings. So the goal is to create a nice cross section with like an X shape or a plus sign, with the violin pointing in one direction and the bow pointing in the other. So the section of string between the fingerboard and the bridge is the designated space for contact between the bow and the string as it creates the best sound. It's really easy for a beginner to start kind of hovering over the fingerboard or kind of slipping over the bridge. So let's talk about the technique that's going to give yourself those nice straight strokes when you're playing. When you think about it, there are actually 4 sections to your arm and your hand, which are going to create movement in the bow. So first, we have the upper arm and the shoulder, we have the forearm and the elbow, we have the wrist, and we have the hands and fingers. So just kind of try it out. Use one section at a time and see how it makes your bow move differently. The initial tendency is to use only the upper arm and the shoulder, or maybe even the upper arm and the forearm, to make these bow movements. Beginners will often ignore the wrist and the fingers if they're not really thinking about it. So let's break it down a little bit and talk about what each area's job is. First, we have the upper arm and the shoulder. The biggest mistake beginners make is when they use this area to make the bow move back and forth with these kind of large movements. And this is really the biggest culprit of a wayward bow. This area's job is to really have an up and down motion to create, to make the bow move from the higher strings to the lower strings and back again. A good exercise to create good habits is to kind of play up against a wall. And this will lessen the tendency to make those back and forth movements and let you focus on those up and down movements. A second exercise is to just challenge yourself to move this upper arm and shoulder area as little as possible. When you're in the process of creating good habits, these 2 exercises are really going to make a big difference. So next, we have the forearm and the elbow. This is the actual area that's going to be creating most of those back and forth motions. But let's switch to a pencil for a moment. If we are up against a wall and relying on our forearm and elbow only, those back and forth motions are pretty much going to make us stab ourselves with our bow. So we're still not getting that straight bow that we're looking for. But let's move on to the next section so we don't hurt ourselves while bowing incorrectly. Next, we have the wrist. The wrist by itself will make these kind of small up and down and back and forth movements. As players become more advanced, they actually spend a lot of time working on their wrist movements, because during these small wrist movements make it really easy to play quick passages rather than using kind of the whole arm, which wastes precious time. But for now, we're going to practice coupling the forearm with the wrist. And so as you're going up and down, just simply give your wrists a little more movement. And we have an even straighter line than we did before. So your line is really making a big difference at this point. So the last thing that we want to do is add in the fingers and the hand. So the final touch is creating the straightest bow strokes, and it comes from the fingers and hands. So if we add that into our bow strokes, we really create the straightest movement. And actually this action from the hand and fingers is really going to create really smooth bow changes. And now, granted, this is a little more difficult for beginners, but it's worth knowing that this is really a goal that you want to strive for. So as you practice putting all these things together, practice playing with long notes or really slow, simple scales while looking in a mirror. A mirror is going to help you immensely trying to figure out if your bow is straight or if it's crooked. So while you're doing that, you can really pay attention to how straight or crooked your bow movements are while looking in a mirror. That's going to be vitally important. So we went over a lot of details with how the arm moves the bow, but let's remember the key points. Number 1, keep your upper arm and shoulder from moving back and forth, and really challenge yourself to move it as little as possible. You can practice up against a wall. Number 2, use the forearm and elbow for most of your back and forth movements. Number 3, add the wrist movements to straighten out the bow even more. Number 4 is to step up your game. Once you've gotten the hang of 1 through 3 and you can give more attention to the hand and fingers, you're really going to create the straightest bow possible. And number 5, play in front of a mirror. Check your position and focus on creating bow strokes that really move in a straight line. That mirror is going to be so helpful to you. So practice these things diligently because, as you know, it takes talent to be a good musician, but it takes practice to become a great one.